Christopher Pallis by David Goodway. Christopher Pallis was the principal writer, translator, and thinker of the Solidarity Group, which was at its most active and exerted greatest influence in Britain during the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. It was a section of the old left which broke away to become, it can now be seen, part of the new left, although it has never been accepted as such, especially since it almost immediately passed beyond any recognizable Marxism to a fully left libertarian position, while largely holding back from the self-description of anarchist. Pallis, in particular, was always extremely critical of anarchism, denying that he himself was an anarchist, only being comfortable with the appellation of, quote, libertarian socialist. Because of the way in which his writing fell between the poles of Marxist humanism and anarchism, because it overwhelmingly appeared in cyclo-styled publications, never being reprinted by mainstream publishers, because of his own pseudonyms such as Martin Granger, and especially Maurice Brinton, Pallis has never received the recognition that the quality of his political output deserves. Although in the late 60s and early 70s, Solidarity's ambition was to inspire, by its example, a major movement, and indeed, at one time or another, at least 25 groups existed in London and elsewhere. In terms of numbers, its membership was never appreciable. Its best-known adherent was almost certainly Ken Livingstone, sometime leader of the GLC, the Greater London Council, and former mayor of London. That's hilarious. He's a bit of an infamous figure in the critique of left anti-Semitism. Anyway, and former mayor of London, who in an interview with Tariq Ali recalled that in the late 60s, quote, "For a short period I joined an organization called Solidarity. Is it still going? Just about. I was just about going then, but I didn't play much of a role in its deliberations," end quote. Yet this is to miss the point. Solidarity's significance lay not in its size, but in the excellence of its publications. The group was initially called Socialism Reaffirmed, and its journal first appeared in October 1960 under the title of Agitator, redolent of the Trotskyist origin of the group's most founding members. But from the 6th issue, May 1961, it became Solidarity. It seems significant that both the IWW and the Shop Stewards and Workers' Committee movement, with their very similar industrial politics, had published journals with the same name. Solidarity, with the striking subtitle For Workers' Power, came out every 2 to 4 months until 1977, when there was a merger with the Social Revolution Group, resulting in Solidarity for Social Revolution. Around 1982, the original London group resumed publication of Solidarity, eventually adopting the subtitle of A Journal of Libertarian Socialism. Yet after 31 issues of the new series, the paper folded in 1992, and the group is now defunct. In parallel to the journal, there were more than 60 impressive pamphlets and 4 important books. It was through the circulation of the pamphlets in particular that a wider radical readership was aware of the group's ideas, and it was through the excellence of its journal, pamphlets, and books in general that Solidarity exerted significant influence in the 1960s and 1970s amongst anarchists and libertarian socialists. Stuart Christie, for example, attests, quote, "What did catch my imagination were the shit-stirring, disruptive, action-oriented ideas of the Solidarity Group," end quote. For a few months in the early 1960s, Solidarity exercised a key role on the national level in shaping the outlook of the most militant section of the nuclear disarmament movement. CND had been launched in 1958, but by autumn of 1960, dissatisfaction with its legal methods and constitutional action spawned within it the Direct Action Committee of 100. It has been seen in Chapter 12 that the committee's sit-downs peaked on the 17th of September 1961 in Trafalgar Square, and that the failure 2.5 months later of the demonstration of the 9th of December at the NATO base at Wethersfield, Essex, led to the decentralization of the committee into 13 regional committees. The London Committee of 100 now became the dominant body, and the Solidarity Group, quote, one of the most important influences, end quote, in 1962 and 63 and after. The most authoritative historian of the nuclear disarmament movement concludes, quote, it was in practice a combination of solidarity and anarchistic activists who constituted the militant hardcore of the committee in this period. The long, harsh winter of 1962-3, one of the 20th century's worst, saw renewed crisis, now acted out with the London Committee of 100. The radicals, mainly from or close to Solidarity, circulated the arrestingly titled discussion document, Beyond Counting Arses, advocating radical subversive action. Quote, we must attempt to hinder the warfare state in every possible way. The Spies for Peace were essentially this group, locating and entering the regional seat of government at Warren Row, Berkshire, and circulating the pamphlet, Danger, Official Secret RSG 6. Thereby, many of us, on the Aldermaston March of Easter, 1963, were diverted to explore the sinister surface buildings of the subterranean bunker. The anarchist Nicholas Walter, as has been explained, was the only member of the Spies for Peace ever to declare himself or herself publicly. Of the 8, 2 were women, until another did in 2010. For a short time, he was very close to Solidarity, attending its group meetings and writing pamphlet 15, the RSGs, 1919 to 1963, which detailed the historical development of the RSGs. The distinctiveness of Solidarity's politics was primarily twofold. There was its irreverent, humorous iconoclasm of all left orthodoxies, the importance and novelty of which cannot be stressed too much, since the self-important ideologues of the far left have little sense of the comic. Amen to that. This is combined with the publication of the writings of Paul Cardin. Quote, we are ourselves and nothing more. We live here and now, not in Petrograd in 1917, not in Barcelona in 1936. We have no gods, not even revolutionary ones. Paraphrasing Marx, quote, philosophers have only interpreted the world. What is necessary is to change it, end quote. We might say that, quote, revolutionaries have only interpreted Marx or Bakunin. What is necessary is to change them, end quote. We are the products of the degeneration of traditional politics and of the revolt of the youth against established society in an advanced industrial country in the second half of the 20th century. The aim of this book is to give both purpose and meaning to this revolt and to merge it with the constant working class struggle for its own emancipation, end quote. This is from the introduction to Solidarity's second book, Cardin's Modern Capitalism and Revolution. In addition to text by Cardan in the journal, Solidarity also brought out 9 pamphlets by Cardan. Socialism Reaffirmed, released possibly in 1961. The Meaning of Socialism, 1961. Socialism or Barbarism, 1962. The Crisis of Modern Society, 1966. From Bolshevism to Bureaucracy, 1967. History and Revolution, a revolutionary critique of historical materialism. Workers' Councils and the Economics of a Self-Managed Society, 1972. Redefining Revolution, 1974. And History as Creation, 1978. With the publication of the last, Paul Cardan was finally revealed as one of the pseudonyms of Cornelius Castoriadis. Pierre Chaulieu and Jean-Marc Caudray were 2 others. Cornelius Castoriadis had been born in 1922 in Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was still called, grown up in Athens, joined the Greek Communist Party as a teenager, but moved to Trotskyism during the Second World War and was involved in the resistance against the German occupation. Under threat of death from both fascists and Stalinists, he escaped to France in 1945 and, as a statistical economist, became a high-ranking official of the Organization for Economic Cooperation, superseded in 1961 by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In 1949, Castoriadis was a founding editor of Socialisme au Barbarie, which ran until 1965. With Situationism, Socialisme au Barbarie was to be a prime influence in the events of May 1968. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, in particular, gladly acknowledged his, quote, plagiarism. Although the future postmodernist Jean-François Lyotard was also a member of the group, the other principal theorist in Socialisme au Barbarie was Claude Lefort, until he broke in 1958 to form with others, the Information et Liaisons Ouvrières. Later transformed into Informations et Correspondances Ouvrières, which was to be another influence on Cohn-Bendit. For Solidarity, Socialisme ou Barbarie were, quote, our French co-thinkers, end quote. Castoriadis not only considered that Western capitalism was becoming increasingly authoritarian through a process of bureaucratization, which would eventually lead to totalitarianism, and its working classes would be impelled to revolt on account of the intrinsic contradiction of capitalism, their exclusion from participation in the workplace. He also believed that in the Soviet Union the bureaucracy had formed a new ruling class, which was crucial. What was crucial was not who owned the means of production, but who controlled the means of production. Bureaucratization had occurred first in Russia, inducing and accelerating the movement towards it within capitalism. Russian capitalism was hence a higher form into which Western capitalism was developing. The proletariat, quote, never frees itself completely outside of production from the influence of the capitalist environment in which it lives, end quote. On the other hand, quote, in the course of production, the class constantly creates the elements of a new form of social organization and of a new culture, end quote. So Castoriadis came to advocate a society self-managed by autonomous workers, a prescription that was central to Solidarity's politics. And in France, his notion of autogestion did come to exercise some considerable appeal in the 1970s. Quote, the Commune of 1871, the Soviets of 1905 and 1917, the Russian factory committees of 1917 to 1918, the German workers' councils of 1919 and 1920, the Italian factory committees of 1921, the council set up by the Spanish workers in 1936 and 37, and the Hungarian workers' councils of 1956, were at one and the same time organs of struggle against the ruling classes and its state, and new forms of social organization based on principles radically opposed to those of bourgeois society. The quotations are taken from, end quote, the quotations are taken from Castoriadis' Proletariat et Organisation. I don't know, I can't speak French. Which first appeared in Socialisme ou Barbarie in 1959 and was translated as, quote, working class consciousness in Solidarity in 1962. Solidarity regarded it as, quote, so basic a statement of our views, end quote, that they broke with custom by reprinting it 7 years later. Quote, organs of struggle against the ruling class and its state, new forms of social organization based on principles radically opposed to those of bourgeois society, end quote. This is the kind of potential Solidarity conceived the Committee of 100 is having. It should also be apparent that Castoriadis' position in this article is indistinguishable from anarchism. In 1970, Castoriadis retired from the OECD, becoming a French citizen, and then in 1974, a psychoanalyst. He began to reprint his early political writings, and for the first time to write books, now using his real name. Rather than advocating, quote, socialism, by the end of the 70s he had come instead to use the term, quote, autonomous society. But Solidarity, which had otherwise followed in his theoretical wake, did not do likewise. Castoriadis died in Paris in 1997. While an American solidarist called Owen Cahill did some of the earlier Cardan translations, these were always revised by Pallis, who in any case wrote all the introductions and translated the bulk of the text. It was Pallis and Ken Weller who were and remain the principal figures in a talented group. Weller was a young London engineer and Amalgamated Engineering Union shop steward. It was he who was largely responsible for Solidarity's extensive industrial coverage and analysis, for which in the 1960s it seemed most likely the group would be principally remembered. Christopher Agamemnon Pallis, Chris Pallis as he was always known, was an immensely gifted intellectual whose career was similar to Castoriadis' at several points. Pallis was born in Bombay in 1923 to a distinguished Anglo-Greek family of whose intellectual achievements he was always immensely proud. His grandfather, Major General Agamemnon Pallis, was aide-de-camp and head of the military household to King Constantine of Greece. Agamemnon Pallis's brother Alexandros was a poet and central figure in the Demotic literary movement in Greece. It was his translation of the New Testament into Demotic Greek that provoked the bloody gospel riots of 1901 in Athens. Alexandros Pallis, who in the 1890s had settled in Liverpool, where he was to become Greek consul, and whose son Marco became a notable Tibetan traveler. He was the author of Peaks and Lamas, 1948, and an authority on Buddhism. Had previously worked in India for Raleigh Brothers, the family firm of merchant bankers. Chris Pallis's father, Alec, was general manager of Raleigh Brothers in Bombay, and when he, for his part, decided to retire and return to Europe, he chose to live in Switzerland, and in consequence his son received most of his schooling there, becoming fluent in not only English and Greek, but also French. It was Pallis's experience at the Collège Classique Gymnase Lausanne, where the pupils included boys of very different class backgrounds, that aroused his sense of social justice and converted him to socialism. In 1940, the family was able to take the last boat from France and become resident in England. Pallis went up to Balliol College, Oxford, in 1941 to read medicine and instantly joined the Communist Party of Great Britain, but was almost immediately expelled on account of his criticism of its policy on the Second World War. He therefore moved on to Trotskyism in support of the Revolutionary Communist Party. In May 1945, the RCP contested the, to Trotskyist, mythic Neath by-election. In May 1945, the RCP contested to the Trotskyist mythic Neath by-election, and Special Branch reported that Pallis spoke there under the first of his pseudonyms, apparently N. Castings. From 1947, when, however, the RCP was disintegrating, the pursuit of his medical career led to a complete cessation of political activity for a decade. The previous year, returning to the south of France, he met Jean Marty, a working-class university student, her father a Parisian postal worker, and on the train to Paris. They were married in 1947 and were to be inseparable companions until his death in 2005. Pallis's clinical studies were at the Radcliffe Infirmary, Oxford, and he afterwards worked as a hospital doctor, first in 1947 to 1950 for the Government Medical Service in Malaya, where his existing interest in tropical medicine shifted to neurology, and later in Cardiff, 1953 to 1957, where he completed his doctorate on, quote, anomalies of the craniovertebral junction. He moved to London in 1957, and the following year took up an appointment as consultant in neurology at the Hammersmith Hospital, becoming also a lecturer in the Royal Medical Postgraduate School, University of London. Here Pallis was to work until his retirement in 1982 as reader and head of the Department of Neurology. On arriving in London, Pallis had made contact with the group that was to become the SLL in 1959, under the autocratic leadership of Jerry Healy, who I think went on to have a huge sex abuse scandal within the SLO, which I guess was the Trotskyist party's name that he was head of. This soon began to hemorrhage with the loss of many of its most able members. Reflecting on the bizarreries of the SLL, renamed the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the New Left historian John Saville comments, quote, Trotskyism was anti-Stalinist, of course, but their creeds were dogmatic, inflexible, and sectarian to a quite remarkable degree, end quote. In 1960, Pallis, as a member of the SLL's National Committee, took part in the expulsion of a group that contained Ken Weller, but within several months he too had seceded. Along with the SLL's industrial organizer, Bob Pennington, Pallis was already familiar with socialisme ou barbarie, and together with Weller, Pennington, and more ex-SLL members, and some other dissident socialists, formed, on the basis of the French journal's critique of Bolshevism, the Libertarian Socialism Reaffirmed group, which was to be renamed Solidarity. Pallis carried over the pseudonym of Martin Granger from his SLL activism, and as such, in 1961, contributed the diary to a pamphlet on the Belgian general strike of 1960-61, and jointly wrote a long article on the Paris Commune with Philippe Guillaume of Socialisme ou Barbarie. In summer of 1961, however, he was exposed by the press, the Daily Mail revealing the secret of Dr. Pallis. He is, quote, he is Martin Granger, leader of industrial strife movement. If he had not been at Hammersmith, where there was, unusually for the medical profession, a clutch of left-wing sympathizers, he could well have lost his job. Thereafter, abandoning Martin Granger, all his political writings and translations were either anonymous or signed Maurice Brinton, or M.B. Unusually, I think, neither Martin Granger nor Maurice Brinton was chosen for any particular association, both composites probably being assembled through a random search in the telephone directory. And unlike Cornelius Castoriadis, he never had any wish to resort to his real name. The substantial selection of his political writings for Workers' Power, which was published 3 months before his death in 2005, was only allowed on the strict understanding that his real name was not revealed. The trauma of 1961 and the endangering of his neurological career had induced a certain paranoia, although he was again outed in 1974, this time as Maurice Brinton. By then, his political extremism was well known, and his professional position so secure that his post was in no way endangered. Although Pallis's writings for Solidarity and its associated publications extended over 2 decades, he did not consider that he personally contributed theoretically, regarding himself as merely the translator and transmitter of Castoriadis' ideas, as well as an activist who sought their practical application. In what then does Pallis's achievement consist? First, he has been assessed by Richard Taylor as, quote, the most dominant individual, end quote, within Solidarity, and by someone even better placed to know, Nicholas Walter, its, quote, main leader or, quote, leading figure. All this is acknowledged by Ken Weller, regarded by Pallis as not just his closest political friend, but his best friend tout court, sentiments that are entirely reciprocated. Secondly, Pallis was the creative translator of Castoriadis, thereby introducing him, when he was known as Paul Cardin, to the Anglophone world, and indeed beyond. With the exception of the 4 items, articles, and our pamphlets drawn from Marxism and Revolutionary Theory, which came to form part 1 of the major book, The Imaginary Institution of Society, all of Pallis's translations were utilized in David Curtis's massive 3-volume edition, though covering only 1946 to 1979, of the political and social writings of Castoriadis. Curtis goes so far indeed as to dedicate his very substantial and useful Castoriadis reader to Maurice Brinton. But Pallis both added to and subtracted from Castoriadis's dense and frequently obscure texts, making them accessible to political militants, not only working class but middle class. His translations were, as Walter commented, quote, often improvements on Cardan's originals, end quote. Pallis himself once explained, quote, our text is a close, but not always literal translation of the French original. The milieu in which our pamphlet will be distributed and discussed differs from that of the 1957 article. Throughout, our main concern has been with getting essential concepts over to as wide and unspecialized an audience as possible. To a great extent, this has influenced our choice of wording and sentence structure. Paragraphs have been shortened. A number of sectional and chapter headings have been added. Some additional footnotes have been inserted, clearly indicated as solidarity footnotes. One or two of the original footnotes have been omitted, and one or two others incorporated into the text proper, which has been slightly shortened, end quote. In contrast, Curtis dropped Pallis's popularizing elements and reverted to the originals, despite their frequent turgidity. Thirdly, Pallis writes very well. He is lively, his style is punchy and accessible, and he possesses a wicked sense of humor. Especially noteworthy are his vivid eyewitness reports from upsurges of popular self-activity, the Belgian general strike of 1960 to 1961, Paris in May 1968, and rural and urban Portugal in 1975 and 1976. Pallis was a merciless reviewer and polemicist, and although in controversy he can seem to get bogged down in finicky detail, as in the article France, the Theoretical Implications, Solidarity and the Neo-Narodniks, and Factory Committees and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, he always moves on to such bold and arresting generalization that the effort of following his argument is fully rewarded. Bold and arresting generalization that the effect of following his argument is fully rewarded. A definite limitation, though, is the repetitiveness of Pallis's prose. For example, in 3 of the articles reprinted in For Workers' Power, he quotes Spinoza's tag, quote, neither to laugh nor to weep, but to understand, end quote, and the splendid passage already cited from the introduction to Cardan's Modern Capitalism and Revolution reappears in As We Don't See It as, quote, we want no gods, not even those of the Marxist or anarchist pantheons. We live in neither the Petrograd of 1917 nor the Barcelona of 1936. We are ourselves, the product of the disintegration of traditional politics, in an advanced capitalist country in the second half of the 20th century. It must be recalled that Pallis was following a crowded and successful career as a medical scientist, all his political writings being the product of his spare time. In this and other defining ways, such as his concern with sexuality and with the application of scientific method to the socio-political realm, he resembles his anarchist contemporary, Alex Comfort. For Comfort was, also, as has been seen in Chapter 11, a great recycler of previously published material and repeater of well-turned phrases. It needs to be insisted, too, that Pallis wrote with no thought of eventual republication in such a volume as For Workers' Power. If he had been able to edit it himself, it would have been considerable interest to see how much cutting and rewriting he would have subjected his prose to. All the same, the socialist journalist, Paul Anderson, who was reading For Workers' Power, when he heard of Pallis's death, avers, quote, "I had been struck by how exciting I still found his writing. Brinton's style is aphoristic, his approach to received wisdom scornful, his erudition apparent but never intrusive. Very few political writers are thrilling. Brinton was and still is." End quote. Anderson testifies that Pallis, through both his own writing and his translations of Castoriadis, had a bigger impact on his political outlook than anyone other than his grandfather, a Marxist printer, and Orwell. Finally, despite his disclaimer, Pallis was responsible for original work in certain areas going beyond Castoriadis. The Irrational in Politics, as a booklet originally published in 1970, soon became known in abbreviated title, explores the role of sexual repression and authoritarian conditioning in generating socio-political conformity, being considered by one reviewer as Solidarity's best work to date. While derivative of Wilhelm Reich, as Pallis fully acknowledged, he is here probing at that central matter of the proletariat. Outside of production, never freeing itself, quote, completely from the influence of the environment in which it lives, end quote. He is able, very convincingly, to point to the sexual permissiveness of the 1960s as a major breakthrough in the, quote, undermining of tradition, end quote, and terminating a vicious cycle. Whereas, quote, for Reich, any large-scale sexual freedom was inconceivable within the framework of capitalism, end quote. Quote, the change in traditional attitudes is both gaining momentum and becoming more explicit in a manner which would have surprised and delighted him, end quote. On the other hand, the pessimism only 4 years later of his review, in which there is a rare glimpse of his professional expertise, of George Frankel's The Failure of the Sexual Revolution, needs to be taken into consideration. Although I personally find Pallis's handling of materials and development of his ideas in The Irrational in Politics disappointing, he was tackling an issue of undeniably central importance, and one, moreover, that few, if any, contemporary left-wing groups would have considered to be political. Also, dating from 1970, is Pallis's chief d'oeuvre, which Castoriadis, who is to anticipate it in his own introduction to the French edition of Kollontái's Workers' Opposition, rightly assessed as, quote, remarkable. This is The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, 1917 to 1921, The State and Counter-Revolution, which originally appeared as a 100-page book tracing the obliteration of the Russian factory committees of 1917 to 1918, so that by 1921, Russian factories and trade unions had been subordinated to the new Bolshevik state and the party. Quote, in 1917, it had been proclaimed that every cook should learn how to quote, in 1917, it had been proclaimed that, quote, every cook should learn to govern the state, end quote. By 1921, the state was clearly powerful enough to govern every cook. Extraordinarily, but significantly, this very necessary task had not previously been attempted, and the anarchist conclusions properly drawn are, quote, the basic question, who manages production after the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, should therefore now become the center of any serious discussion about socialism. Today, the old equation, liquidation of the bourgeoisie equals workers' state, popularized by countless Leninists, Stalinists, and Trotskyists, is just not good enough, end quote. In his stimulating Rethinking the Russian Revolution, the highly regarded Russianist Edward Acton, reviewing the libertarian interpretation of the revolution, cites the Bolsheviks and workers' control more times than any of Berkman, Volin, Arshinov, or Maximov. This is quite a tribute. Pallis is well known in libertarian circles for Paris, May 1968, The Irrational in Politics, and the Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, 3 publications that have been widely read and admired, and each has gone through a number of editions. In the case of The Irrational in Politics, in the 5 years after its first appearance, it had been translated into French, German, Swedish, and Greek, and had been published in the USA, Canada, and Australia. Within little more than 3 years, The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control was translated into French, Dutch, German, Swedish, Spanish, Greek, and Japanese. Paris, May 1968, was not only the first pamphlet or book to be published as early as June 1968, but remains one of the best participant accounts there is of the, quote, events in France. A reviewer later that year acclaiming it for giving, quote, the clearest possible picture of what was actually happening, it managed to somehow capture the very flavor and essence of the inspiring moment taking place. Like no other publication, it carries with it the very smell of tear gas, the very guts of revolution, end quote. Pallis was a prolific writer. A provisional checklist of his post-Trotskyist political publications, coming up with around 110 items, whether articles, pamphlets, books, and film reviews, or translations, and in addition, there are many anonymous articles that decades later it is not possible to assign with certainty, as well as figurative leaflets. Many of these would not be entirely his work. Solidarity editorials, such statements as we see it, and as we don't see it, and introductions would all be circulated within the group for criticism and rewriting. For Solidarity not merely advocated libertarian ultra-democracy, but actually practiced it. This was a major reason for Pallis wishing to maintain his pseudonym, and in a very real sense his anonymity, regarding himself as merely the communicator of the group's collective position and analysis. In 1960, Pallis abandoned the SLL and rejected Trotskyism, proceeding to draft the leaflet, quote, Socialism Reaffirmed, dated October 1960. That this document should be fully libertarian may seem extraordinary until it is recalled that he was already familiar with socialism au barbari, and indeed, at around this time, an article by Castoriadis from Socialisme au Barbari, number 1, was published with the identical title, Socialism Reaffirmed, as the new group's first pamphlet. In the leaflet, quote, the fundamental contradiction of contemporary society, end quote, is identified as, quote, its division into those who own, manage, decide, and direct, and the majority who have to toil and are forced to comply with decisions they have not themselves taken, end quote. What the working class requires is, quote, a revolutionary organization, not as its self-appointed leadership, but as an instrument of its struggle, end quote. This organization, quote, should anticipate the socialist future of society rather than mirror its capitalist past, end quote. The 3 criteria being that, quote, local organs have the fullest autonomy, end quote. Direct democracy is practiced wherever possible, and, quote, all central bodies having power of decision involving others should be constituted by delegates, these being elected by those they represent and revocable by them at any time." End quote. These points, as well as others in the leaflet, were to be reiterated in the years that followed, reappearing constantly. In Socialism Reaffirmed, Pallis quotes for the first time one of his favorite dicta of Marx's, quote, "The emancipation of the working class is the task of the workers themselves," end quote. He also counters Lenin's insistence, to which he was continually to return, that, quote, "the workers can only develop a trade union consciousness," end quote, contending that the working class is, quote, "capable of rising to the greatest heights of revolutionary consciousness and challenging the very basis of all exploding regimes," end quote, by pointing to its achievements in the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and the Revolution of 1917, the Spanish Revolution, and the Hungarian Revolution, a catalogue that he was to repeat and to extend. Another major theme which Pallis touches on in Socialism Reaffirmed is not only that working class trade union and political organizations have now degenerated, expressing, quote, "non-proletarian social interest," end quote, but that this degeneration has a, quote, "subjective basis in the imposition of capitalist methods of thinking and organization into the ranks of the labor movement," end quote. This he developed the following year in, quote, in the article Revolutionary Organization. Quote, "Exploiting society consciously encourages the development of a mass psychology to the effect that the ideas or wishes of ordinary people are unimportant, and that all important decisions must be taken by people specially trained and specially equipped to do so. All the ruling groups in modern society encourage the belief that decision-taking and management are functions beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. All means are used to foster this idea. Not only do formal education, the press, the radio, television, and the church perpetuate this myth, but even the parties of the so-called opposition accept it, and in doing so lend it strength. All the political parties of the, quote, left oppose the present order only by offering, quote, better leaders, more, quote, experienced, and more capable of solving the problems of society than those who mismanage the world today," end quote. And so, quote, "the Labor Party, Communist Party, and the various Trotskyite and Leninist sects all extol the virtues of professional politicians or revolutionaries. All practice a rigid division within their own organization of leaders and led. All fundamentally believe that socialism will be instituted from above and through their own particular agency. Each of them sees socialism as nothing more than the conquest of political power and the transformation by decree of economic institutions. The instruments of socialism in their eyes are nationalization, state control, and the, quote, plan," end quote. 15 years later, introducing Phil Mailer's Portugal, The Impossible Revolution, Pallis reflected gloomily on, quote, "the risk of genuinely radical upheavals being deviated into state capitalist channels. It is the danger that any new creation, in the realm of ideas, relationships, or institutions, will immediately be pounced upon, penetrated, colonized, manipulated, and ultimately deformed by hordes of power-hungry, quote, professional revolutionaries. These people bring with them attitudes and patterns of behavior deeply, if not always consciously, molded by Lenin's notion that the workers left to themselves, quote, can only develop a trade union consciousness," end quote. Quote, "Their current organizational practices and their prescriptions for the future are bureaucratic to the core. Their preoccupation with leadership destroys initiative. Their concern for the correct line discourages experiment. Their obsession with the past is a blight on the future. They create around themselves a wasteland of cynicism and disgust, of smashed hopes and disillusion. that buttresses the deepest dogma of bourgeois society, namely that ordinary people are incapable of solving their own problems by themselves and for themselves. His prediction was that, quote, by themselves and for themselves, end quote. His prediction was that, quote, in future upheavals, the traditional revolutionaries will prove part of the problem, not part of the solution, end quote. In contrast, revolutions in the past could either be defeated by those whose privileges they sought to destroy, as with the Paris Commune, Germany 1918 to 1919, Spain and Hungary, or, quote, they could be destroyed from within through bureaucratic degeneration, as happened in the Russian Revolution of 1917, end quote. It was the latter, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, that Pallis is obsessed. It is with the latter, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, that Pallis is obsessed in his writings. And when I first encountered him back in 1963, inviting him to speak to the Oxford Anarchist group, this was the topic he chose. In 1961, he introduced for Solidarity the section on Kronstadt from Victor Serge's Memoirs of a Revolutionary, a major work not then available in English, and this was later published as a pamphlet, Kronstadt, 1921. There followed in 1962 his impressive edition of Alexandra Kollontai's The Workers' Opposition, reprinted for the first time in English since its original appearance in 1921 in Sylvia Pankhurst's Workers' Dreadnought, as, quote, a contribution to the great discussion now taking place concerning, quote, what went wrong, end quote. Pallis next produced the first English translation of Ida Metz's The Kronstadt Commune. Finally, in 1970, came the outstanding and very original The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, his study of how the Bolsheviks defeated the revolution in the factories. This relentless preoccupation with the Russian Revolution, whereas the achievement of the Spanish Revolution is only ever mentioned in passing, may perplex readers only familiar with world politics since the collapse of communism. But those who recall any part of the period between 1917 and 1989 will attest how central analysis of the apparently actually existing socialism in Russia, China, and their satellite slave states was not just to Stalinists, Trotskyists, and other Marxist-Leninists, but even to anarchists and social democrats. All the same, Pallis's 2 decades of Trotskyism and his belief during those years that the Soviet Union was a, quote, deformed worker state clearly molded his mindset and range of reference for many years to come. As late as the early 1970s, a publicity leaflet for the Bolsheviks and Workers' Control addressed those who were still Trotskyists. Comrades, you have more or less seen through Stalinism. Now shed your last illusions. You can't fight bureaucracy by bureaucratic methods. Why cling to the Leninist and Trotskyist myths? Let the dead bury the dead. One more effort to total demystification and to become real revolutionaries. An article he wrote as Martin Granger for the group which would shortly become the SLL in the issue of its weekly celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, illustrates how well the intellectually impoverished automatism that was requisite. Quote, how they took power in Petrograd. A breathless chronology from February to October begins, quote, "Red flags had appeared on many official buildings in February, but in reality little had changed. The socialist ministers held office by kind permission of the classes they claimed to have overthrown, but were frightened of the power and problems suddenly thrust upon them. Their social traditions, their intellectual incapacity, and their meager theoretical baggage all dictated that they should share this power with the bourgeoisie. But in so doing, they took upon themselves the solution of insoluble tasks, for the interests of the people were irreconcilably opposed to those of the propertied classes. The inner logic of the revolution soon expected all those who failed to grasp this essential fact." End quote. The upbeat final paragraph is equally hackneyed. Quote, "The night the new All-Russian Congress of Soviet Workers and Soldiers' Deputies meets, elects a Bolshevik leadership, and in the early hours of November 8th, issues the first of its momentous appeals to the workers of Russia and of the whole world, the foundation stone of proletarian power had been laid." End quote. Only 3 years separates the unthinking piety of this fourth-rate piece from the subversive radicalism of socialism reaffirmed. Yet the passage from the parrot cry orthodoxy of Trotskyism to an innovative libertarianism is not peculiar to Pallis and some of his fellow solidarists in Britain. In France, Castoriadis, Lefort, and Socialisme au Barbarie had led the way to libertarian socialism, and Daniel Gorin was later to move to an outright anarchism. In the USA, Marie Bookchin, previously a Trotskyist for many years, became an excitingly original anarchist thinker, and Dwight MacDonald had earlier advocated a creative anarcho-pacifism during his editorship of Politics. Also in the States, C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya, and their Johnson Forest tendency moved to a distinctive libertarian socialism, as James continued to do after being deported to Britain in 1953. Indeed, there were close relations between Socialisme au Barbarie and the Johnson Forest tendency for 10 years, Castoriadis contributing with James and Grace Lee to Facing Reality. So Trotskyism has possessed an impressive capacity. For generating some of the most outstanding modern anarchists and libertarian socialists, notable not only their fresh thinking, but also their theoretical rigor. There can be no doubt that Pallis's primary intellectual influence is that of Castoriadis, and only secondarily their mutual indebtedness, great though it is, to Marx. During 1964-5, Castoriadis published in Socialisme au Barbarie, Marxisme et théorie révolutionnaire, in which he broke decisively with Marxism. Pallis translated in 1966 a first installment of this substantial text as, quote, "The Fate of Marxism," which initially appeared in Solidarity and was later reprinted by Solidarity Clydeside as a pamphlet of the same title. In The Fate of Marxism, Castoriadis argues, quote, "For the last 40 years, Marxism has become an ideology in the full meaning that Marx himself attributed to this word. It has become a system of ideas which relate to reality not in order to clarify reality and to transform it, but on the contrary, in order to mask reality and justify it in the abstract." End quote. He concludes, quote, "We have now reached the stage where a choice confronts us, to remain Marxists or to remain revolutionaries," end quote. Pallis's comment is that this text is, quote, "bound to infuriate those who have never had a new idea of their own," end quote, alluding to one of his favorite aphorisms applied throughout all sections of the left, not least the Anarchist, and attributed in 1969 to the Victorian writer Walter Bagehot, quote, "One of the greatest pains to human nature is the pain of a new idea," end quote. One of Pallis's major strengths is his ability to relish, quote, "the pain of a new idea," end quote. But it was not until 1972 that he published another extract from Marxism and Revolutionary Theory, and in which this time Castoriadis ditched historical materialism as the pamphlet History and Revolution. Pallis defended this, quote, "revolutionary critique of historical materialism," end quote, declaring, quote, "I've enjoyed writing this article, firstly because the discarding of an illusion is like the shedding of a load. One moves about more freely without it. Secondly, because to help demystify others, far from being barren, is a fruitful activity in itself." He explains, end quote, he explains, quote, "In both modern capitalism and revolution and history and revolution, Cardan demands that revolutionaries apply to Marxism itself one of the most profound of Marx's insights, that the dominant ideas of each epoch are the ideas of its ruling class. Marx wrote in a period of full bourgeois ascendancy. It would have been a miracle if some bourgeois ideas had not permeated his own writings," end quote. While Pallis continues to believe in the continuing validity of such features of Marxism as, quote, "the class struggle, the concept of surplus value, the theory of alienation, the importance of economic factors in historical development, the need ruthlessly to demystify all ideologies," end quote, Marxist economics and the materialist conception of history are in contrast, quote, "suspect." He concurs with the identification of the, quote, "alien bourgeois element," end quote, in Marxist interpretation of history, in the Marxist interpretation of history. For Castoriadis, quote, "sees it in the attempt by Marx and Engels to apply the whole of human history," Jesus Christ. For Castoriadis, quote, "sees it in the attempt by Marx and Engels to apply to the whole of human history certain categories and relationships which are not transcendental, but which are themselves the product of historical development, and more particularly of the rise of the bourgeoisie. Among such historical, non-transcendental categories and relationships, he stresses two, the notion of the primacy of the economy and the concept of a certain pattern of interaction, determination, between economic, quote, infrastructure and ideological, quote, superstructure. The retrojection of these categories and patterns onto other areas of history with a view to constructing a universal and, quote, scientific theory of history can only be achieved through a systematic rape of the facts," end quote. Very, very interesting. Sorry, I'm thinking about, I just read The Violence of Abstraction by Derek Sayers, and it's precisely, literally, this passage could have been out of that book, but it's an affirmation of Marx and a critique of Marxism, not a critique of Marx like Castoriadis is doing here. Very interesting. You wonder, like, what when people like abandon Marxism, you kind of like wonder, or jettison Marx as like a framework for, and his work as a framework for analyzing social reality. You wonder, like, exactly what part are they dissatisfied with, and does that part that they dislike justify jettisoning the whole apparatus? Anyway, sorry. Introducing Redefining Revolution, a translation of Recommencer la Révolution, In 1974, Pallis explained, quote, "In a chemical reaction, there is no element of choice. The water in the kettle cannot choose not to boil when the kettle is placed on the fire." End quote. Quote, "Social development," end quote, however, quote, "cannot be brought down to the level of a chemical reaction. There is a choice wherever people are concerned," end quote. Positivism, determinism, and Marxism are all replaced by a philosophical and postmodern libertarianism. Quote, if a scientific theory of history can predict history, there is no such thing as genuine choice. If it cannot, then scientific interpretations of the past are subject to the same limitations as similar prediction of the future, end quote. This is from the introduction to the third installment of, quote, Marxism. This is from the introduction to the third installment of Marxism and Revolutionary Theory, published as History as Creation in 1978. What is now central for Pallis and Castoriadis is, quote, genuine creation. Quote, the act of producing affairs, end quote. Quote, such creation plays a major role in history, end quote, by its, quote, very nature, end quote, define the, quote, dictates of predetermination, end quote. As Pallis was increasingly emancipated from the shackles of Marxism-Leninism in the form of Trotskyism, and eventually indeed from any form of Marxism, he became correspondingly creative and daring in his writings. While fully revealed during the 1970s, this was becoming apparent by the late 1960s. As early as 1965, Pallis would celebrate the, quote, balkanization of utopia. Quote, there is no road to utopia, no one organization or prophet or party destined to lead the masses to the promised land. There is no one historically determined objective, no single vision of a different and new society, no solitary economic panacea that will do away with the alienation of man from his fellow men and from the products of his own activity. End quote. Pallis even concluded that this is, quote, the sole guarantee that utopia, if we ever get near to it, will be worth living in, end quote. A pluralist belief remote from Trotskyism or indeed from class struggle anarchism. While Pallis continued to believe in 1972 that, quote, in modern industrial societies, socialist consciousness springs from the real conditions of social life, end quote, he came to emphasize the importance of the non-economic realm of exploitation, as in Capitalism and Socialism of 1968. Quote, a society in which relations between people are based on domination will maintain authoritarian attitudes in relation to sex and to education, attitudes creating deep inhibitions, frustrations, and much unhappiness. From his earliest days, man is subjected to constant pressures designed to mold his views in relation to work, to culture, to leisure, to thought itself. The socialist revolution will have to take all these fields within its compass, and immediately, not in some far distant future. The revolution must, of course, start with the overthrow of the exploiting class and with the institution of workers' management of production, but it will immediately have to tackle the reconstruction of social life in all its aspects. If it does not, it will surely die, end quote. And in 1970, he introduces in the irrational in politics the extremely important concept of recuperation, which had originated with the Situationists, explicating it more fully 4 years later in the Malaise on the left. Quote, over the last few decades, and in many different areas, established society has itself brought about a number of things that the revolutionaries of yesterday were demanding. This has happened in relation to economic attitudes, in relation to central forms of social organization. This has happened in relation to economic attitudes, in relation to certain forms of social organization, and in relation to various aspects of the personal and sexual revolutions, end quote. It is legitimate, he says, to refer to this adaptation as, quote, recuperation, when it actually benefits the established society, contributing to the established society's continuance as an exploiting hierarchy. Pallis's politics are fully anarchist. In his analysis of existing society, in his vision of a socialist society, and in the means he advocates in order to get from here to there. On the other hand, he resolutely rejected much of anarchism, and like Castoriadis, refused to describe himself as any sort of anarchist. The affiliation that satisfied him is rather, quote, libertarian socialism. A raft of issues filled him with scorn for most varieties of anarchism, whereas he highlights the need both to take on broad new ideas and to supplement emotion with understanding. He commented acidly that, quote, anarchist abstentionism in both areas seems to be as old as the hills, end quote. Most anarchists incline to either the insurrectionism of Bakunin, or the communism of Kropotkin, but Pallis, reviewing Paul Avrich's The Russian Anarchists, has no time for either man, regarding the former as, quote, muddle-headed, Bakunin as muddle-headed, which is how he also was to describe Proudhon, and an authoritarian conspirator, and the latter as a romantic visionary who pined for a pastoral utopia, quote, oblivious to the complex forces at work in the modern world, end quote. In contrast, he approves of the anarcho-syndicalist J.P. Maximoff, and also Ida Met, the platformist author of the Kronstadt Commune, who represents, quote, what is best in the revolutionary tradition of, quote, class struggle anarchism, end quote. Quote, she thinks in terms of a collective proletarian solution to the problems of capitalism, end quote, as opposed to, quote, the rejection of the class struggle, the anti-intellectualism, the preoccupation with transcendental morality, and with personal salvation that characterize so many of the anarchists today, end quote. Drink time. Sorry if I read too fast. It's just if I read super slow, I kind of bore myself to death by the sound of my own voice. There is also the central matter of organization. In his introduction to Murray Bookchin's essay, quote, on spontaneity and organization, Pallis equates Bookchin's understanding of spontaneity with his own notion of autonomy, as developed in Solidarity and the Neo-Narodniks, concurring that, quote, spontaneity does not preclude organization and structure, end quote, but that spontaneity, quote, yields non-hierarchical forms of organization, end quote. While it is, of course, a fallacy that anarchism and organization are incompatible, some anarchists have always opposed organization, and it is understandable, highly regrettable though it is, that Bookchin, who after many years contesting anti-organizational and lifestyle anarchists, and sharing very similar theoretical and political perspectives, as well as background to Pallis, ceased to call himself an anarchist. It has already been mentioned that some of Pallis's best writings consists of his first-hand descriptions of major upsurges of popular self-activity. He was present for the opening days of the Belgian general strike of 1960 to 61, and from the end of the decade comes the widely read Paris, May 1968. It is remarkable that it was through chance that he happened to be already in France for other reasons, and hence was able to produce the two pamphlets. On the other hand, he was obliged to take holidays to visit Portugal in 1975 and 1976 in order to write two Portuguese diaries. It was virtually automatic that he should cover Solidarność in 1980, but he did not visit Poland to do so. The common themes are admiration for the creativity of ordinary people in struggle and the contempt for the degeneration, Stalinism, and political irrelevance of the communist parties, the vanguardist presumption of the Trotskyists and Maoists, and the corruption and bureaucracy of the social democratic parties and trade unions. From 1960, Pallis's political articles and translations appeared in great profusion for 20 years. But after suddenly this summer, published in October-November 1980, they almost entirely ceased. It was on the 13th of October 1980 that BBC One transmitted a panorama feature, Transplants, Are the Donors Really Dead?, angering the medical profession on account of its irresponsibility and resulting in a decline in the number of kidneys donated for transplants. At that time, brain death was an issue little studied in Britain, but Pallis was already experienced in diagnosing it and was commissioned by the British Medical Journal to write a series of articles on the subject, later collected as ABC of Brainstem Death. In consequence, his concept of and criteria for brainstem death have been internationally adopted, and his later entry on death for the Encyclopaedia Britannica is a masterpiece of historical and medical summary. Pallis's intellect, command of logic, and charismatic enthusiasm made him an outstanding exponent of clinical neurology. Internationally, he was probably the best-known English neurological teacher of his time by virtue of his many overseas trainees at the Royal Postgraduate Medical School, who discovered through him that a traditionally esoteric field of medicine could be a simple one in practice. He traveled widely, especially in Asia, always accompanied by Jean, studying tropical diseases of the nervous system and the cultures in which these occurred. His free-thinking approach is evident in the Neurology of Gastrointestinal Disease, published in 1974, a transdisciplinary monograph written with Paul D. Lewis. Towards the end of his career, after completing his work on brainstem death, he became a noteworthy expert witness on legal cases involving complex neurological issues. There is much reference in Pallis's political writing to, quote, bureaucracy and the, quote, bureaucratic, the division of society between order givers and order takers. Following Castoriadis, he had defined bureaucratization in 1965 as, quote, the organization and control of activity from the outside, end quote. And a bureaucracy in 1975 as, quote, a group seeking to manage from the outside the activities of others, end quote. If that is bureaucracy, it is a perennially recurring feature of human societies and equally to be perennially resisted. But by what is it to be replaced? It is in The Malaise on the Left of 1974 that Pallis describes socialism as, quote, the creation of forms of living that will enable all, free from external constraints or internalized inhibitions, to rise to their full stature, to fulfill themselves as human beings, to enjoy themselves, to relate to one another without treading on anybody, end quote. 2 years later, he asked, quote, can one imagine any socialism worth living under without self-managed individuals, collectivities, and institutions, end quote. Since the 1970s, there have been vast economic, social, and political changes throughout the world, but Pallis's vision of a non-hierarchical and free society remains as valid and as necessary as it ever was.